transport in New Zealand, with its mountainous topography and a relatively small population mostly located near its long coastline, has always faced many challenges. Before Europeans arrived, Maori either walked or used watercraft on rivers or along the coasts. Later on, European shipping and railways revolutionized the way of transporting goods and people, before being themselves overtaken by road and air, which are nowadays the dominant forms of transport. However, bulk freight still continues to be transported by coastal shipping and by rail transport, and there are attempts to introduce public transport as a major transport mode in the larger population centers, historically very car-dependent. As of 2010, transport funding in New Zealand is still heavily dominated by money for road projects. The national government proposes to spend $21 billion on roading infrastructure after 2012, yet only $0.7 billion on other transport projects. This has been criticized by opponents of the current government strategy as irresponsible, in light of increasing fuel prices and congestion. Government has claimed that the priority on roads is in line with New Zealanders' favored travel modes, and as being the most promising in terms of economic benefits. Road transport. The state highway network is the principal road infrastructure connecting New Zealand urban centres. It is administered by the New Zealand Transport Agency. The majority of smaller or urban roads are managed by city or district councils, although some fall under the control of other authorities, such as the New Zealand Department of Conservation or Port and Airport authorities. New Zealand has left-hand traffic on its roads. History. Before Europeans arrived, Maori either walked or used watercraft on rivers or along the coasts. The road network of New Zealand has its origins in these tracks and paths used by Maori and later by Europeans in their early travels through New Zealand. Several major Maori tracks were known, such as the Western Coastal Track was used along the whole length of the North Island, and a track on the east coast, which left the coast near Castle Point and rejoined it near Napier, in the South Island. Another major track existed down the east coast, with tributary tracks following streams up to the mountain passes to the west coast. Mountains, swamp, and dense bush made inland routes tricky to traverse, and early settlers also made use of beaches as roads for walking, riding horses, and herding sheep. Many farms had access via beaches only, and beaches were used as runways for planes. Some beaches are still used by planes, for example at Tokarito and on the west coast of Stewart Island. Initial roads, such as the Great South Road southwards from Auckland, were often built by the British Army to move troops, and were constructed to a comparatively high standard. Early sheep farming required few high-standard roads, but the strong increase in dairy farming in the late 19th century created a strong demand for better links on which the more perishable goods could be transported to market towards ports for export. In many cases, later roads for motor vehicles follow paths used by bullock carts which followed tracks made for humans. These in turn in some cases became highways with attendant problems all over New Zealand. Is the geography and contours of a slow-speed road laid out in the first half of the 20th century usually do not conform to safety and comfort criteria of modern motor vehicles. Early road construction was both hindered and helped by rail transport during the first half-century of European settlement. Authorities were reluctant to expend large amounts of capital on more difficult sections of a route where there was a hope that a railway might instead be built. However, where railways were constructed, Roads often either preceded them for construction or quickly followed it when the newly accessible land started to be settled more closely. The New Zealand highway system was extended massively after World War II. The first motorway was built in the environs of Wellington and opened in 1950, between Takapu Road and Johnsonville. Following heavy investment in road construction from the 1950s onwards, public transport patronage fell nationwide. This has been described, in Auckland's case, as one of the most spectacular declines in public transport patronage of any developed city in the world. Network New Zealand has a state highway network of 10,895 kilometres, of which 170 kilometres are motorways. These link to 82,000 kilometres of local authority roads, both paved and unpaved. The state highways carry 50% of all New Zealand road traffic, with the motorways alone carrying 9% of all traffic. Speed limits. The maximum speed limit on the open road is 100 km per hour for cars and motorcycles, with 50 km per hour the common limit in residential areas. Speed limits of 10 to 90 km per hour are also used in increments of 10 km per hour, and the posted speed limit may be more than the allowed speed limit for a particular vehicle type. Speeds are often reduced to 30 km per hour beside roadworks. Private landowners may set their own speed limits, for example 5 km per hour, although these are not enforced by police or road authorities. The Land Transport Rule setting of speed limits allows road controlling authorities to set enforceable speed limits, including permanent speed limits, of less than 50 km per hour on roads within the jurisdiction. However, there are still very few areas of the country's road network with permanent speed limits below 50 km per hour. Road safety. Total road deaths in New Zealand are high by developed country standards. 2010 figures from the International Transport Forum place New Zealand 25th out of 33 surveyed countries in terms of road deaths per capita, a rank that has changed little in 30 years. The fatality rate per capita is twice the level of Germany's, or that of the United Kingdom, Sweden, of the Netherlands. This is variously blamed on aggressive driving, insufficient driver training, old and unsafe cars, inferior road design and construction, and a lack of appreciation of the skill and responsibility required to safely operate a motor vehicle. In 2010, 375 road users were killed in New Zealand, while 14,031 were injured, with 15 to 24-year-olds the group at highest risk. The three most common vehicle movements resulting in death or injury were head-on collisions, loss of control, and loss of control. In terms of deaths per 10,000 population, the most dangerous areas were the Waitomo district and the Mackenzie district. Larger cities were comparatively safe, with Auckland City, Wellington and Christchurch, while Dunedin had a higher rate of 43. New Zealand has a large number of overseas drivers, as well as renting camper vans, motorhomes, RVs during the New Zealand summer. Overseas licensed drivers are significantly more likely to be found at fault in a collision in which they are involved, compared to fully licensed New Zealand drivers, and only slightly less likely to be found at fault than restricted New Zealand drivers. Drunk driving is a major issue in New Zealand, especially among young drivers. New Zealand has relatively low penalties for drunk driving. In the late 2000s, reports indicated that the rate of drunk driving by under-20s in Auckland had risen 77% in 3 years, with similar increases in the rest of the country. Many drunk drivers already had convictions for previous drunk driving. In the Safer Journeys strategy, intended to guide road safety developments between 2010 and 2020, The Ministry of Transport aims for a safe systems approach, prioritized 4 areas, being increasing the safety of young drivers, reducing alcohol, drug-impaired driving, safe roads and roadsides, and increasing the safety of motorcycling. Funding. Historically, most roads in New Zealand were funded by local road authorities who derived their income from a local rates, as the need for new roads was often most urgent in those parts of the country where little rate income could yet be collected. The funding was at least partly dependent on national-level subsidies, for which much lobbying was undertaken. Many acts and ordinances were passed in the first decades of the colony, but lack of funds and parochialism hindered the growth of the road network. This lack of larger-scale planning eventually led to increased public works powers given to the central government. Today, all funding for state highways and around 50% of funding for local roads comes directly from road users through the National Land Transport Fund. Road user revenue directed to the fund includes all fuel excise duty on LPG and CNG, around 55% of revenue from fuel excise duty on petrol, all revenue from road user charges and most non-ACC revenue from motor vehicle registration and licensing fees. In addition, in the last 3 years the government has increasingly allocated additional funds to land transport, to the extent that today the total expenditure by the New Zealand Transport Agency on land transport projects exceeds road tax revenue collected. The remainder of funding for local city and district roads primarily comes from a local authority property rates. As of 2010, transport funding in New Zealand is still heavily biased towards road projects. The national government proposes to spend $21 billion on roading infrastructure after 2012, yet only $0.7 billion on other transport projects. This has been criticized by opponents of the current government strategy as irresponsible in light of increasing fuel prices and congestion. Government has claimed that the priority on roads is in line with New Zealanders' favoured travel modes, and as being the most promising in terms of economic benefits. Vehicle fleet. One of the earliest counts estimates of motor vehicles in New Zealand had them at 82,000 in 1925. This soon increased to 170,000 on the eve of World War II in 1939, continuing to 425,000 in 1953 and increasing to 1 million in 1971. Today, the New Zealand vehicle fleet counts 3.24 million vehicles. Of the fleet, 2.60 million were light passenger vehicles, 0.38 million were light commercial vehicles, 0.11 million were trucks, 0.08 million were buses, and 11 million were motorcycles and mopeds. The mean age of a New Zealand car was 13.2 years, with trucks at 15.1 years. Just over half of the light passenger vehicles first registered in New Zealand are used imports. In 2013, new car registrations were up 7% on 2012 to 82,235 sold, with used vehicle sales up to 98,971. At the 2013 New Zealand census, 92.1% of households reported owning at least one car, 37.6% reported owning one car, 38.4% reported as owning two cars, and 16.1% reported owning 3 or more cars. Car ownership was highest in the Tasman region and lowest in the Wellington region. Passenger services. transport by bus services form the main component of public transport services in New Zealand cities, and the country also has a network of long-distance bus or coach services, augmented by door-to-door intercity shuttle vans, a type of shared taxi. The first widespread motor vehicle services were shared taxi services termed service cars, whose significant early provider was ARD, operating elongated Hudson Super 6 coaches. By 1920 ARD covered most of the North Island and even provided transport for the Prince of Wales. By 1924 the services covered even more areas. ARD was taken over by New Zealand Railways road services in 1928. The road fleet of New Zealand Railways Corporation was privatised in 1991, with the long-distance business still existing as Intercity, having more recently incorporated Newman's coach lines. Another former extensive coach business was Mount Cook Landlines, which closed in the 1990s. Internet-based Naked Bus.com is building another nationwide network, partly as a reseller of several smaller bus operators' capacity. Intercity and Tourism Holdings Limited are significant sightseeing tourism coach operators. Cycling, while relatively popular for sport and recreation, bicycle use is a very marginal commuting mode, with the percentage share hovering around 1% in many major cities, and around 2% nationwide. This is primarily due to safety fears. For instance, Auckland Regional Transport Authority reports that over half of Aucklanders believe it is usually unsafe, or always unsafe, to cycle. The high risk to bicycle users is due to a number of factors. Motorists tend to exhibit hostile attitudes towards bicycle riders. Bicycles are classed as vehicles, a transport class legally obliged to use the road, forcing bicycle users to mingle with heavy and fast-moving motor vehicles. Only postal workers are legally permitted to ride on footpaths. Bicycle infrastructure and the standards underpinning bicycle infrastructure planning are poor, and bicycles receive relatively very low levels of funding by both central and local government. It has also been argued that the introduction of New Zealand's compulsory bicycle helmet law contributed to the decline in the popularity of cycling. Rail transport network. There is a total of 3,898 kilometers of railway line in New Zealand, built to the narrow gauge of 1,067 millimeters. Of this, 506 kilometers is electrified. The national network is owned by state-owned enterprise New Zealand Railways Corporation Division Kiwi Rail Network. The national network consists of 3 main trunk lines, 7 secondary main lines, and during its peak in the 1950s, around 90 branch lines. The majority of the latter are now closed. Most lines were constructed by government, but a few were of private origin, later nationalized. In 1931, the Transport Licensing Act was passed, protecting the railways from competition for 50 years. The transport industry became fully deregulated in 1983. Between 1982 and 1993, the rail industry underwent a major overhaul involving corporatization, restructuring, downsizing, line and station closures, and privatization. In 1993 the network was privatized, and until 2003 the national network was owned by Transrail, previously New Zealand Rail Limited. The government agreed to take over control of the national rail network back when Toll Holdings purchased Transrail in 2003. In May 2008 the government agreed to buy Toll NZ's rail and ferry operations for $665 million, and renamed the operating company Kiwi Rail. operators and services. Bulk freights dominate services, particularly coal, logs and wood products, milk and milk products, fertilizer, containers, steel and cars. Long-distance passenger services are limited to 3 routes: the Transalpine, the Transcoastal and the Northern Explorer. Urban rail services operate in Wellington and Auckland, and interurban services run between Palmerston North and Wellington and Masterton and Wellington. For most of its history, New Zealand's rail services were operated by the Railways Department. In 1982, the department was corporatised as the New Zealand Railways Corporation. The corporation was split in 1990 between a limited liability operating company, New Zealand Rail Limited, and the corporation, which retained a number of assets to be disposed. New Zealand Rail was privatised in 1993, and renamed Transrail in 1995. In 2001, Transrail's long-distance passenger operations, under the guise of TransScenic, became a separate company. Transrail chose not to bid for the contract to run Auckland's rail services, and the contract was won by Connex. Proposals to sell Transrail's Wellington passenger rail services, Transmetro, did not come to fruition, although the division became a separate company in July 2003. In 2003, Transrail was purchased by Australian freight firm Toll Holdings, which renamed the company Toll NZ. The only other significant non-heritage operator is the tourist-oriented Taieri Gorge Railway in Otago, which runs regular passenger trains on part of the former Otago Central Railway and some on the main South Line. Heritage. The Federation of Rail Organisations of New Zealand coordinates the work of approximately 60 heritage railways and rail museums. Most of these are operated by groups of volunteers and have a historical or tourist focus. Water transport. New Zealand has a long history of international and coastal shipping. Both Maori and the New Zealand European settlers arrived from overseas, and during the early European settler years, coastal shipping was one of the main methods of transportation, while it was hard to move goods to or from the hinterlands, thus limiting the locations of early settlement. The two main islands are separated by Cook Strait, 24 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, but requiring a 70 km ferry trip to cross. This is the only large-scale long-distance car passenger shipping service left, with all others restricted to short ferry routes to islands like Stewart Island, Rakiura, a Great Barrier Island. New Zealand has 1,609 kilometers of navigable inland waterways, however these are no longer significant transport routes. International shipping. Historically, international shipping to and from New Zealand started out with the first explorer traders, with New Zealand waters soon becoming a favorite goal for whalers as well as merchants trading with the Māori and beginning European colonies. In the 19th century, one of the most important changes for New Zealand shipping, and for New Zealand itself, came with the introduction of refrigerated ships, which allowed New Zealand to export meat to overseas, primarily to the United Kingdom. This led to a booming agricultural industry which was suddenly offered a way to ship the goods to markets around the world. Larger, deeper draft ships from the middle of the 19th century made dredges a common sight in shipping channels around New Zealand, and tugboats were also often bought to assist them to the quays, where electric or hydraulic cranes were increasingly used for on- and offloading. However, manpower was still needed in large amounts, and waterfronts were the hotbeds of the industrial actions of the early 20th century. In the 1970s, containerization revolutionized shipping, eventually coming to New Zealand as well. The local harbour boards wrought massive changes on those ports selected to handle the new giant vessels, such as Lyttelton and Auckland Port. Gantry cranes, straddle carriers and powerful tugboats were built or purchased, and shipping channels dredged deeper, while large areas of land were reclaimed to enable the new container terminals. The changes have been described as having been more radical than the changeover from sail to steam a century before. However, containerization made many of the smaller ports suffer, this being only later recovered somewhat with newer, smaller multi-purpose ships that could travel to smaller ports, and the loosening of the trade links with the United Kingdom, which diversified the trade routes. The time for river ports had gone, however, and most of them disappeared, facing particular pressure from the new rail ferries in the 1980s. Deregulation also involved and heavily changed the port industry, with harbour boards abolished, and replaced by more commercially focused companies. Many port jobs were lost, though shipping costs fell. Coastal shipping. As noted above, coastal shipping has long played a significant role in New Zealand. It was very efficient for moving large amounts of goods, and relatively quick. In 1910, it was noted in a discussion with the Minister of Railways that a fruit grower at Port Albert had found it cheaper to ship his canned fruit to Lyttelton in the South Island by boat, and thence back to Auckland again, rather than pay rail freight rates from nearby Wells to Auckland. The industry, however, also faced a number of troubled times as well, such as during World War II, when ship requisitioning caused shortages in the transport operation. While many ports reopened after the war, they faced huge pressure from rail. After cabotage was abolished in 1994, international shipping lines became able to undertake coastal shipping as opportune to them on their international routes to New Zealand, while reducing the cargo reshipment rates for New Zealand industry. This is seen by some as a heavy blow for local competitors, who, specialized in coastal shipping only, are less able to achieve the cost savings of large lines. These can generally operate profitably even without cargo on New Zealand internal legs of the routes, and are thus able to underbid others. The law change has been accused of having turned the New Zealand business into a sunset industry, which will eventually die out. In the financial year 2003-2004, coastal cargo in New Zealand totaled around 8.6 million tons, of which 85% was still carried by local, and 15% by overseas shipping. In 2009, the National Party announced that funding for coastal shipping and supporting infrastructure, part of the Sea Change plan of the previous Labour government, would be cut to a substantial degree. The move was heavily criticised, amongst others, by the Green Party and the Maritime Union of New Zealand. Ferry services. Regular roll-on, roll-off ferry services have crossed Cook Strait, linking the North and South Islands between Wellington and Picton. Since 1962, Inter-Island Line, a division of Kiwi Rail, owns the main inter-island ferry service, the Inter-Islander. Two of the three ferries used by the Inter-Islander are Ahura and Aratira, rail ferries with special rail decks. The largest and newest ferry, Kaitaki, came into service in September 2005. A competitor service is operated by Strait Shipping Limited, using the former French Santa Regina and the former Danish Straitsman, under the Blue Bridge brand. Depending on the vessel, usual transit time between the North and South Islands is between 3 hours and 3 hours 20 minutes. Faster catamaran ferries were used by Transrail and its competitors. To reduce voyage times, Transrail proposed to relocate the South Island terminal of its services to Clifford Bay in Marlborough, which would also avoid a steep section of railway. This proposal has been shelved since the takeover by Toll Holdings in 2003. Smaller ferries operate in the Bay of Islands, Rawane, Auckland, Tauranga, Wellington, the Marlborough Sounds and Lyttelton, and between Bluff and Half Moon Bay. A passenger ferry service also operated for many years between Wellington and Littleton. This service was operated by the Union Steamship Company, and the passenger ferries typically operated an overnight service, although in later years the last of these vessels, the Rangatira, operated alternate nights in each direction plus a daylight sailing from Littleton to Wellington on Saturdays. One of these passenger ferries, the Wahine, was lost in a storm as it entered Wellington Harbour on the 10th of April 1968, with the loss of 51 passengers and crew. The final sailing of the Rangatira, which was custom-built and entered service in 1972, was on the 15th of September 1976, after 2 money-losing years. Ports and harbours: container ports, ports of Auckland, Port of Tauranga, Napier, Wellington, Nelson, Littleton, Timaru, Port Chalmers, Bluff. Other ports: Whangarei, Devonport, Gisborne, New Plymouth, Wanganui, Picton, Westport, Greymouth, Freshwater, Rotorua, Taupo, Queenstown and Kingston, Te Anau and Manapouri. Merchant Marine Fleet ships by type: Bulk 3, Cargo 2, Container 1, Petroleum Tanker 2, Roll-on, Roll-off 1. Total 9 ships, totaling 69,685 GRT, 106,627 tons deadweight. Air transport. Airports: there are 113 airports in New Zealand. The main international airport is Auckland Airport, which handled about 11 million passengers in 2005. Christchurch Airport around 6 million passengers per year, and Wellington Airport around 5 million passengers per year, with paved runways. Total: 10,000 feet or more, 8,000 feet to 9,999 feet, 5,000 feet to 7,999 feet, 3,000 feet to 4,999 feet, under 3,000 feet, 5 with unpaved runways. Total: 5,000 feet to 7,999 feet, 3,000 feet to 4,999 feet, under 3,000 feet. 39. Heliports: 1. Auckland, Mechanics Bay. Airlines: National Airline, Air New Zealand. Pipelines: petroleum products 160 kilometers, natural gas 1000 kilometers, liquefied petroleum gas 150 kilometers.